How would I define LGBTQ sober, safe spaces? That's a really good question.
Being in place with conversation areas, community resources, maybe a couple pool tables.
I think it's a place that you can do your daily activities and that you can just exist. And it is a place where the people around you inherently understand.
It's really just the bare minimum things that often aren't met in places that are supposed to be safe for LGBTQ plus people.
Creating inclusion isn't only just letting anyone in your space, it's showing them that you created a space for them.
In the chair, there's always time for conversation.
The hair salons can be places where a lot of social interaction takes place. And, that may be some of the only social interaction a person gets depending on their social circles.
Younger folk now have more information and resources to understand who they are at younger and younger ages. Holding space for young queer folk really matters that much more. But yeah, it really becomes challenging to find what is that model to replicate and how to spread that out so that more of these spaces do exist and meet the needs that are out there. So third spaces as a sociological concept is kind of tricky because a lot of times third spaces require purchases. You have to pay to be in a place, and that's challenging too for our community when we generally have lower socioeconomic status anyway.
Really the only places that I could think of that were for queer people would be, like gay bars and stuff.
Gay bars are kind of the most marketed queer spaces.
I think when we're talking about sober spaces, a lot of times we assume the issue is alcoholism. That's the first thing that comes to mind. And we know that we do have sometimes a more of an issue with alcohol addiction in the queer community than what some other communities might face. And there's a variety of reasons for that. Minority stress being, a definite factor in that. But there are so many health reasons outside of just addiction. So, non-sober spaces are important because queer spaces are important.
To clarify this, my parents are actually also lesbians, which is interesting in that growing up, they didn't really even have any sober spaces. It was basically like gay bars that they could go to. There was no place that they could really comfortably take me as a child. But I do remember being really young, and there was a period of my life when my grandma was working at a gay bar downtown, and I remember it sucked. I couldn't go inside and be in those spaces. If I wanted to talk to my parents' queer friends, it was like standing in the parking lot. That was a place that I wasn't allowed to be, and I wasn't allowed to interact with those queer spaces.
Gay bars are extremely important, but I also think their importance is going down over the years, because it used to be that was the only place you could be, and that was the only community you could gather.
I kind of have issues with noise sensitivity, and most bars they're blasting music constantly, and for one, I can't hear. For two, it just kind of puts me on edge.
If you're lucky, you might have a community center or an organization of some type and a gay bar. And if your community has both of those things, you're pretty lucky. That's more than most communities have.
So when we're talking about sober, safe spaces, I think that's where it's important to talk about monthly outreach, who is a place for the youth in our community to go to find and meet other queer people their age and other support systems for their identities when they don't have a queer bar available to them.
My name is Laura Janney. I am the founder and the director of Muncie Outreach. I started Outreach because I have a gay kid, And he's older now, but at the time he felt isolated and bullied at school. So we would drive him to Indiana Youth Group, IYG in Indianapolis, so he could find his tribe and see other people like him. Outreach is more about education and providing resources and asking the hard questions.
Looking at comparing an LGBTQ business compared to a community center, I think that with a community center, there may always be a feeling of, I'm going there because I need help in some way. And there's nothing wrong with that necessarily. That's not an issue.
Not necessarily pressure, but like that's kind of the expectation is like you come here to like get resources to like learn about new things, to like attend the class or something like that. Whereas like a sober safe space would just be like a coffee shop where you're just allowed to just hang out. You know, like the pressure to have to learn or do like activism wouldn't be there. Like you can just hang out and just be there.
I didn't have my first experience with a queer sober space until I went to the Queer Chocolatier in Muncie in college. It was the very first time.
Having a space that is not home and not school or work to be your full self, that's rare for our community. But there should be more spaces that you can be, and I provide one of those spaces to the best of my ability. My name is Morgan Roddy. I use she, her pronouns. I started at Minnetrista Farmers Market and the Muncie Makers Market. And I tell you, the first day I hung up my banner that said Queer Chocolatier, it felt like I was about ready to jump off of a cliff. I was very nervous. I realized at that point I was more than just a person selling chocolate. It was really in those early days that when people would come up and talk to me and share their identities and experiences with me. And that's when we realized that we were filling multiple niches. We were providing a really good product, but we were also holding space for people in a farmer's market setting. And that's when we opened in the village, and then everything really just skyrocketed from there. Having a physical space really changed the game for us. What soon became very obvious was that young folk were coming right after getting out of school from the academy. Really hit home that, oh, this is a place for everybody. And if I were to have alcohol here, it would really shut out a lot of people. And that's where it became more clear that sober space is what people wanted. Not just because they didn't want to have alcohol necessarily, but it was that it would be prohibitive for them to even enter in some cases. But we deserve both and. We deserve sober spaces and alcohol-centered spaces. We deserve a variety of spaces. We don't have to choose.
I really hope that other people can see Queer Chocolatier and then take that inspiration to create more spaces like that. And if there's anything like I've seen is that you have to be very resilient when it comes to a business like this, constantly pushing because like once again, it's not just the money. In fact, money kind of seemed like the last worry. It was more along the lines, the messaging, the point, the belief, the heart of it all.
So Queer Chocolatier has a very social environment, but it's not forced. It's not, okay, speed dating, sit across from each other, make friends. None of that happens. There's a area that's cozy that people want to sit and just be themselves and read a book. There's places that's like a big table where people can gather and sit around and enjoy each other and have conversation. But my preference is to make a space that I would be comfortable in if I were a customer, so I try and make that to be the case. But this reflects back to my friends at Sis Got Tea and Flying Rhino. They are queer business women, and they provide products, and it's, their eventual goal is to have space, but that's kind of what the distinction is, like the service or the product versus the space itself. And I think spaces matter quite a bit, and that's what makes things like this a little bit more unique.
I actually think with like queer sober spaces, we don't give the idea of like queer service spaces enough credit, because it makes your like experiences that much more pleasant. I mean, I can't imagine how much more pleasant experiences with like healthcare would be if there were more queer and trans doctors or psychiatrists, like even things that you don't think of wanting a queer person in, you know, like that position. It would make it much easier. Even something like a haircut became much easier with a queer person, like on the other side of the scissors.
Doing hair is totally a service, for sure. You're working with someone, creating something that they want for them.
You don't want to have to explain yourself, or you don't want to say, I need a gender neutral haircut, or I'm not feeling feminine enough today. Can you help me feel feminine? So it's important to have someone who understands that and can relate to it, and someone that you feel very comfortable with.
So my name is Olive. I am a hairstylist here in Fort Wayne. My pronouns are they, them. I have been doing hair for 7 years, and I started in a smaller town here in Indiana. And so when I moved to Fort Wayne, I made the effort to just be as openly myself as possible. And mostly that was just for me. I wanted to be able to come to work and feel safe. But what I found in that is that people now see me online and see that I am a queer hairstylist and that I create a safe space for people, and I attract a lot of that inside here as well. Just saying, I do all haircuts. No matter what gender you are, you can get whatever haircut you want. Things just like having a chair that is essentially wide enough to fit all body types is also showing people that you're as inclusive as you can be, and showing not only are you saying anyone's welcome here, but you're showing them there is a spot for you here.
The person I just went to this past weekend, he's an ally. He's got like the little sign on his door. And he actually asked me halfway through, he's like, hey, you know, what do you identify as? I want to make sure I get all this like set up for you. First time I've had anybody from a stylist standpoint actually cut my hair similar to a way I wanted. So it makes a difference.
Having a salon that's intentional about serving our community is so important. I mean, it's not like we can, you know, sit there and chill out all the time, but you're still building a relationship with people near you and having conversations.
It's very different to be able to say things about like my girlfriend and like my lifestyle without having to think, do I need to explain this thing I'm about to say, or do I need to rephrase this in some way for it to seem more palatable? Or like if I were to go to someone new, do I even talk about what I'm doing? You know, in my personal life, that was never like a question in what I was doing when I was with Olive. It was great.
So we have queer chocolate shops and queer hairstylists, and I wonder how far we can take this.
For the purpose of being sustainable, it is important that we have queer businesses that are self-sustaining. That the longevity of that is important, and it's important to know that, you know, we as consumers or as clients or as patrons, that we're part of that community because we contribute to it. We keep it open.
Honestly, queer chocolatier to me was definitely one of a kind. I never had, like, even it's just like the name in itself puts that at the forefront. I have never been anywhere, and I honestly don't know of anywhere around me that is truly a queer sober space. Unfortunately, most of it does cater to like a drinking audience or an adult audience, or it's some sort of like organization itself. It's not like a space you can almost always hold.
You could tell my business changed when I became a brick and mortar space, when people could come in and be in a designated area that allows them to exist freely.
So we really need to diversify the types of queer spaces that we have. Having queer sober spaces just makes sense. The more spaces we have where we can feel safe and secure, the better.